Nick was born and raised. Come closer.
Oh, thank you.
So we have Nick Stong with us. Nick was born and raised in San Diego, California. He attended UC Irvine, graduating with a degree in anthropology in 2008. After college, Nick started his career in informal science education as a presenter at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach. This position helped him discover a passion for talking with people about science and the ocean, and would eventually lead to his role at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. New opportunities led Nick to the Monterey Peninsula and to the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History, where he would manage educational programs there for 3 years, and it gave him a chance to work closely with monarch butterflies. However, the pull of the ocean would eventually lure Nick back to his roots, and Nick now works at the Monterey Bay Aquarium as manager of public programs. Nick lives in Pacific Grove with his 2 children who are now asleep, and a dog, and his lovely wife, Katie, who is here, I think.
Yeah.
All right, please welcome Nick.
Thank you, Terry. If you haven't stood in front of a room of people while someone else talks about you, I'll tell you it's a little weird. But I am happy to be here. Give me a minute while I swap the slides. Stand by. All right. Good evening, everybody. Again, thanks, Terry, for the introduction. I appreciate it. My name's Nick Stong, and I'm really happy to be here talking to you all about monarchs today. Am I too loud, too quiet? Good? Good. All right. I do want to lead with, so when I was invited to speak for this series, I saw the host of other speakers that came before me, and I'll admit I was intimidated. There were astrophysicists and PhD holders, and I do want to say that I am not a monarch scientist. I wouldn't even call myself a monarch expert, but I do think I have had some experiences and have gotten to know this insect in a way that I can share my passion and excitement for it that I hope you find interesting or learn something new. So as Terry said, and I have a few introductory slides, which I don't really need with that wonderful introduction, but as she mentioned, I think where my qualifications lie to talk about, or where they lie, if it's not being a monarch expert, it's that I do like to talk about science. I like to engage the public in these informal settings, museums, aquariums, places like this, and get people excited about animals and nature. I started out doing that on whale watch boats in front of exhibits at the Aquarium of the Pacific. I had the chance to become a certified whale watch naturalist. There on the upper left, I would go out on whale watch cruises, and we would see blue whales and orca whales on a daily basis. It was really, really awesome. And then we would drive this semi-truck all over LA County. It had live sharks and sea stars and sea cucumbers in the back. So we would pull up to schools and lower these hydraulic stairs, and students would come up and get to touch those animals. So that was a really fun experience. Then I went up to the Cal Academy. Raise your hand if you've been up to the Cal Academy in San Francisco. Yeah, awesome place, right? One of my favorite places in the world. I got to present with snakes and other reptiles, which are another passion of mine, but do a lot of the same things I started doing at the Aquarium of the Pacific, so doing presentations in front of our coral reef tank, in front of our penguins habitat, and talking to divers like you see up there on the top right. But then life took me to where I live today on the Monterey Peninsula, and this is where I met monarch butterflies for the first time. Well, I had heard of them, but this is where I sort of became the museum's communication wing, pun intended, for this butterfly, and also a representative for counts. We would go out and count monarch butterflies, and I'll talk about that a little bit tonight as well. But summer camps, all sorts of fun stuff there at the museum. If you haven't been to this place, I recommend checking it out as well. A real small museum, but a good one. And then eventually ended up where I am today at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and I get to continue to talk to people about and get people excited about animals. But tonight, we're going to focus on this animal, so the monarch butterfly, Danaus plexippus. And what I want to do is I'll talk a little bit, I'm going to start with the basics and talk a little bit about life cycle, so some things that probably many of us already know, some things that are true for all butterflies. But then I want to dive deeper, obviously, into this species and talk about what makes the monarch exceptional, what makes it unlike most butterflies. Some of the things that do make it exceptional, one, there is, at least on some devices, the butterfly emoji. So that's kind of cool, right? People think about a butterfly and they think about monarchs. I recently heard monarch butterflies referred to as the great white shark of the butterflies. Yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. But then it was explained and it made sense. So great white sharks are exceptional. They are, in the true sense of the word, they are very unlike most other sharks. They're one of the biggest, this extreme predatory behavior. But when you ask your average person to think of a shark, what are they going to picture? Great white shark, right? Discounting the other almost 400 species of sharks that are, mostly smaller than 6 feet and very different. So same goes with the monarch. You ask someone to picture a butterfly, chances are they might imagine a monarch, but they are quite different from most butterflies. So I found that comparison kind of interesting. They're different because they're larger. So a typical monarch is about 5 inches across. Your average species of butterfly in California is more like a 1 to 2.5 inch wingspan. So that's one of the most noticeable things. They are also poisonous, so we probably know that about them. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well. And perhaps most notably, they undergo long, epic migrations. And we'll definitely dissect that tonight. Okay, but as I mentioned, we're going to start way back at the beginning where the monarch would start, and that is as an egg, same as any other butterfly. Laser pointer. One of the things the monarch is known for is its beauty and its kind of striking appearance as an adult, but I think that beauty starts as an egg. As we can see, it has these kind of corrugated ridges. It's like a little jewel. It's almost like it was designed by a little jewelry maker. Tiny, tiny egg. You wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it or even had a magnifying glass. It's about 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter across. Really fast development. Only takes about 3 to 4 days for this egg to hatch. Out of the egg hatches a tiny caterpillar. And again, very, very small. This is only 1 millimeter high here, top to bottom. So a very, very small caterpillar hatches out. Does anybody know the first thing it's going to eat? Egg case. Yeah, it'll munch down that egg case as its first meal, and then it will go on to eat the only thing this caterpillar will eat for its entire caterpillar life, which is what? Milkweed. Yeah. So this is kind of the first point that this butterfly story diverges from most other butterflies in that it has a host plant. So lots of species of butterflies, including some swallowtails in California, have host plants that they're closely tied to. Their eggs are only laid on those plants. The larval stage of the caterpillars only eat that type of plant, and it's the case with the monarch. What makes them a little different is their host plant happens to be toxic or contain toxins. It is a poisonous plant, and it specifically contains compounds called cardiac glycosides. Cardiac glycosides are the same compound found in some heart disease medications. To be honest, I'm not sure if they're like blood thinning or what exactly they're doing, but at high enough doses, they can stop or lead to cardiac arrest. So they are a poison that affects mostly vertebrate animals. So anything with a backbone, being a bird, a reptile, us, a dog, a cow, would be affected by the toxin found in milkweed. Importantly, for monarch predators, spiders and other invertebrates are less affected, in some cases not affected at all by that milkweed toxin. So they can still be predated upon. But since they're laid on this plant, hatched and grow and eat this plant, they end up having this toxin inside their body and using it as a defense. Okay, so after being in the egg and hatching out, they are now 10 to 14 days as a caterpillar, where they progress through 5 stages known as instars. So we might have the first instar up here, second, third, fourth, fifth. Each one of these stages separated by the shedding of the skin. So the caterpillar will shed that skin as it progresses and grows. And it grows rapidly. They eat a lot of food. And in fact, between this first instar and the fifth, they'll increase their size by a factor of about 2,000. So that is, if you compare it to a human growth rate or a human baby, if you have about an 8-pound baby, like a newborn little baby, at 2 weeks old, that baby would weigh 16,000 pounds. So really, really enormous growth rate, and also speaks to how they're able to pack in so much of this milkweed toxin into their body and to make it an effective defense. Here's a picture that I love. It shows just how massive that growth rate is. A tiny, freshly hatched monarch caterpillar compared to just 2 weeks later, a fifth instar monarch caterpillar. They already have these aposematic colors, these warning colorations, warning predators to stay away. People often ask, how do predators innately know that this means stay away? And it's oftentimes a learned behavior. So if you eat something once and it's kind of grayish and dull and it tastes bad and makes your stomach hurt, but then you go back the next day and there's lots of grayish, dull things, you'll probably have a hard time figuring out which one to avoid. But if that thing you ate that made you feel kind of sick or tasted terrible was really bright and noticeable, it's going to be easier for you to form that memory of, hey, I'm never going to eat that white, yellow, and black striped caterpillar again. All right, so after that, about 2 weeks, this caterpillar is ready for the next stage. It is ready to pupate or become a pupa. So right before this happens, it'll enter what's known as, or referred to as kind of a wandering stage. It will leave its milkweed host plant. It will sort of restlessly begin to wander. It might end up on the side of a barn, the side of a house. It's rarely on the milkweed plant. They typically find somewhere else. It looks like here it's on some milkweed. And then it's going to spin a tiny anchor out of silk, so a small silk anchor. And then when, this is the caterpillar's head here, it has 6 thoracic legs, or 6 legs that are on the thorax. And then it has 5 sets of proto-legs, kind of like faux legs here in the back. And the last set of proto-legs will kind of act like pinchers. They'll pinch into this silk button and make a nice, strong connection. And then it'll kind of do some upside down crunchies here for a while, do some ab work for about 2 hours or so. And then it will shed its skin one final time and reveal its next stage. So again, the beauty kind of follows the monarch at every stage here, I think. Here it is now a pupa, it's a chrysalis. And the chrysalis is specific to butterflies. Has anyone ever heard the term cocoon? And you've heard the term chrysalis. Can anyone tell me what the difference between the two is? Or you can shout it out. You know, anything? Someone making a spinning maybe thing. So the cocoon is specific to moths. So I used to think they were the same. Chrysalis, cocoon, it's just whatever word you choose to use, but they are actually different. The chrysalis, again being butterflies, after that last skin is shed, the body just becomes the chrysalis. Whereas with the cocoon, the silk cocoon is spun around the pupa, and that's more, that is what we see with moths. Okay, so here we have this chrysalis. It's this beautiful seafoam green color with the kind of gold and black striping and these gold buttons down here on the bottom. Then after those 2 weeks have gone by, about 24 hours prior to eclosion or prior to this monarch emerging out and revealing its full glory as an adult butterfly, it will go transparent. So that seafoam green color goes away. It's ready to emerge. Oftentimes, if this is in someone's yard or garden, they think something has gone terribly wrong. It's turned black, like it looks like death. What's happened to my monarch chrysalis? This is normal in that last home stretch before it emerges. Then it's going to push. It's hanging upside down, by the way. Here's its eyes down here. It's got its legs folded up. It's going to push its way out. And then it'll hang for a little while. So when it first comes out, it has a swollen abdomen, tiny crumpled up wings. Those wings would never have fit in that pupa if it was fully expanded. So it'll drip a kind of a metabolic waste fluid called meconium out of the abdomen here. It's bright red, kind of like blood. And then it will pump hemolymph, which is sort of the insect equivalent to blood, through its wings as they expand. So over the course of an hour or two, you can find some really neat time lapses online of the monarchs that sort of hang upside down and twitch around as their wings expand to that full size. Then it's ready. So to recap, we've had 2 to 3 days as an egg, 10 to 14 as a caterpillar, another 10 to 14 as a chrysalis. It's been about 30 days from the time the egg was laid, and you have your adult monarch butterfly. You'll notice that on this last slide, so with each of these, we've named the time frame. Here with the adult butterfly, most monarch adults are going to live about 3 to 6 weeks. 3 to 6 week lifespan, that's it. Pretty short, right? But there are some exceptions, hence all of the asterisks here that we'll talk about. The monarch story gets really interesting when we talk about what time of year they're developing, and where they're developing, and what time of year has a lot to do with how long they're going to live and what they're going to go on to do. In any case, the monarch will no longer need milkweed at this stage in order to eat. It will eat nothing but nectar. So it's lost those mandibles, it's lost those munching, chewing parts that the caterpillar had, and now just has the proboscis that you can see here that it's dipping down into the flower. Okay, so to start to tease out what I mean by the different lifespans depending on where and when, we're going to look at this map for a minute. What I want you to notice is all of these colored sections here are where you find monarchs in North America. So you can see a pretty big swath of our country are places you could find monarchs at some point during the year. I also want to point out this white strip going down the middle here. You want to figure out what that white strip is? Rocky Mountains, yeah. This is the Rocky Mountains. And they act as a pretty effective barrier or separation between what are two distinct populations of monarchs in North America. So over here we have the eastern monarch to the east of the Rockies, and over here we have the west, which is obvious, the western monarch, which is the one that we experience here. The reason the Rocky Mountains are a pretty effective barrier has to do with the fact that monarchs are cold-blooded. Like all insects, they cannot regulate their own body heat. They can't warm themselves up or cool themselves off. They are the temperature of their surroundings. So if it's 40 degrees outside, their hemolymph, their body is 40 degrees. If it's 90 degrees outside, they're going to be about that same temperature. So to get over the Rockies, in most areas, they're going to have to fly to a pretty high elevation. And at a certain point when they go high enough, it's going to get cold enough that they just can't fly anymore. So we tend to see two pretty distinct populations, the east and the west. So we're going to start to talk about the migration, and to do that, I want to start with the east, even though I know they're not the ones that we would see here in Modesto or the Central Valley. But I think it's important to hear about their story first before we then talk about what ours do. Partially because the ones in the east, their story is more popularized. Parts of it have become more ingrained in pop culture and more talked about. So I think it's important to call it out first. So that whole story we just talked about, the monarch life cycle, egg through to caterpillar and pupa and adult butterfly. Let's imagine for a minute that you're a butterfly. You just went through that process. And let's say it's the end of the summer. It's August, mid to late August, and you're somewhere up here to the northern part. And I'm realizing I'm only doing it on this screen, so I'll continue doing this. Everyone look at this screen. You're up here on the northern part of the range, late August, and you're emerging. The days are getting shorter as fall's approaching. The sun's angle is lower in the sky. Something tells you that instead of looking for a mate, mating, and then finding milkweed and laying your eggs, and living that 3 to 6 week lifespan like we saw on the slide before, instead of doing that, something cues you to instead, along with all of the other monarchs that are emerging around this same place and same time, towards the northern range of milkweed, a plant that needs lots of sun and enough warmth. You're up here. Instead of mating and doing all of that, you're going to delay sexual reproduction. So instead of finding a mate, you're going to fly about 2,500 miles to Mexico. And you'll do that along with all the other butterflies that are emerging around that same time. And it's going to be about a 2-month journey that is something that if you're someone who lives anywhere east of the Rockies in any of these Great Plains states, eastern seaboard, even up here in the Northeast, you'll experience monarchs flying through as part of this process. And where you're headed on this 2-month, 2,500-mile journey are the high mountains in the Mexican state of Michoacan. Has anyone ever been to these monarch sanctuaries? You have? Awesome. Recently?
End of October.
Oh, that's amazing. That's awesome. I have not, but I've known people, and especially volunteers at the museum I used to work at, who have gone, and I've heard it's absolutely incredible. You can start to see here that the monarchs just blanket the trees in this area. And what's happened is they've left a spot in the northern US that's going to get too cold, too snowy, too much weather, all the milkweed's going to die off. If the monarchs were to stay in that range, they would all perish, they would all die. So instead they leave and they go to these overwintering sites in the high mountains of Mexico. This isn't a huge area in Mexico. It's a pretty connected small group of mountaintops all around 10,000 feet, mostly Oyamel fir trees that the monarchs find each winter. And you can see it's pretty incredible how many monarchs end up there. We're talking millions upon millions. It's said that so many can end up on single trees that they'll cause the trees to break or fall over. Big branches will just drop because there are so many monarchs on them. Keep in mind, a monarch only weighs about half the weight of a dollar bill, but there's just so many of them that they end up weighing a lot. Here's another picture from the sky. Tons of monarchs. Another one, and it turns out that we'll talk a little later about counting monarchs here in California at our overwintering sites. But here in Mexico, there are so many that they can't count them from the ground. They can't even estimate from the ground, so they do it by helicopter and plane. And the way they do it is they estimate how many hectares, or basically how many acres, are covered by monarchs, and they have a calculation for each hectare or acre equals X amount of butterflies. Another shot of the dense monarchs there in Mexico. Okay, so now these monarchs have left their northern part of their range in August. They have flown 2 months. They begin arriving in Mexico in late October, early November, which a point of interesting cultural significance, I think, is when the monarchs are pouring through these areas in late October, early November, many of the communities and cities and culture down in this area, they've come to associate that with the starting of Dia de los Muertos. And so in fact, when those celebrations sometimes don't start until the monarchs start pouring through their towns. And it's thought to some that those are the souls of their returning ancestors coming back. So it's a really special thing, and it's been going on for thousands of years. So well before Western science knew that the monarchs were going here, we didn't find that out until the 1970s. But the people who've lived in this area knew a lot longer ago that this was a phenomenon. Okay, so now we're in the spring. These monarchs have hung out through November, December, January. It is now spring. The weather's warming up. The days are getting longer. These cold-blooded insects that have hunkered down all winter are starting to stir, and they will warm up and mate, mostly in those sanctuaries, in those same groves of trees that they overwintered in. Here's where the story gets really interesting. So once they've mated and the female has some fertilized eggs, she will depart on a northbound trajectory looking for milkweed. Again, host plant, it's the only thing she'll lay her eggs on. As soon as she finds that milkweed, let's say she finds some here in South Texas or near the border, she's going to lay her 300 eggs, mostly looking for one plant per egg. She needs to find vast fields of milkweed in order to do this. She'll lay those eggs and then she'll die. So she's lived a pretty extraordinary monarch life, 6 to 8 months. Then about a month later, after her caterpillars have developed, and she's long gone, but her offspring are carrying on, they're going to emerge. Again, it's still spring. They're going to mate, fly a little bit further north, find milkweed, lay their eggs, and die. Only a 3 to 6 week lifespan. So these are the more typical monarchs. The next one, same thing. They'll develop, mate, fly north, find some milkweed, lay their eggs, and die. Same thing. The next ones will fly north, mate, lay their eggs on milkweed, and die. It's this relay race back northward. It takes about 4 or 5 generations of monarchs to make it. Until, again, it's late August. It's towards the end of the summer. Another generation, what we dub the super generation, again, is going to emerge in late August. They're going to delay sexual reproduction, say, nope, that's not for us, fly all the way to Mexico and start the process over again. So not only is it multi-generational, but depending on where you are in this cycle, you're going to either have a 6 to 8 month lifespan or a 3 to 6 week lifespan. It's pretty cool, right? And that's the thing that has always fascinated me. So many parts of this story have yet to be kind of teased out and figured out, like, how? How does a monarch that emerges up here, and how does it know to fly to Mexico? Even if they're, okay, let's say their parent or the offspring that laid their egg had gone to Mexico, then you could say, okay, maybe there's some memory that's passed along. Maybe they teach them, or their dying words are like, go to Mexico. But they are 4 to 5 generations removed from any monarch that ever flew to Mexico, and yet they still wake up somewhere up here near Michigan or Canada and fly to these remote mountaintops in Michoacan. That's the kind of mind-blowing part of the story for me. And furthermore, as the successive generations make their way north, they've never done that either. Somehow they know to carry this baton, carry this relay race further north. And science doesn't really know yet. We're not 100% sure how they're even navigating. We think they can see polarized light, and that they can kind of tell with the angle of the sun which direction they're going. But there are a lot of question marks and things that still need to be figured out. So if you get into monarchs, maybe you can be the one to discover that. But remember, everything we've just talked about is the eastern monarch. So if you see a monarch in your yard, in the Central Valley, anywhere in California, it's not going to Mexico. One of the most common questions we would get at the PG Museum is, okay, yeah, this is great. When do these monarchs go to Mexico? They would think that the California overwintering sites were somehow a stopover or a rest stop on the way to Mexican overwintering sites, and it's not the case. Instead of going to Mexico, if you're a Western monarch, same thing, you're up here in late August, all of that, you're making your way north as the milkweed range expands further and further north, but then there's this point at the end of the summer, but instead of going to Mexico, you migrate to the coast of California. So you'll go to one of about 300 distinct overwintering sites. There's a cluster of them in the Central Coast. So Pacific Grove, Natural Bridges in Santa Cruz, a few in Big Sur, one near Cambria. There are some around Santa Barbara, but they stretch as far south as you can see with this blue marking on the map as northern Baja California. And then the story from there is pretty similar. They hunker down in these groves of trees right along the coast. Instead of Oyamel fir trees, it's often eucalyptus, which is interesting because it's not a native California tree, but it tends to fit the shape of their legs, and they're able to hang on to the leaves really well. This picture here is showing a Monterey cypress, another big tree that they like to cluster on. Lots of lace lichen in this picture as well that they're hanging from. Here's another cluster in Pacific Grove. I think this is from 2017. One comment or observation we get a lot of is how gray they look. We're used to bright, beautiful orange monarchs, but once their wings are closed, and when they're in a tree in a cluster, their wings are closed behind them, the outside of the wing is a pretty drab, kind of grayish color. And if you think as an adaptive advantage, having that drab coloration while they're hiding out in the trees is probably beneficial. I wish the lighting was better. Some here are kind of stirring, and you can see they've opened their wings a little, and you see some orange color. But you don't see that real fiery orange until they start flying around. Here are some in just some better lighting, but they also have their wings closed. You can see the very light orange colors. So they're hanging out at our Central California coast sanctuaries through the winter. And then as things begin to warm up in the spring, there are a few recommended times to visit the California coast to see the monarchs. Has anyone ever been to overwintering sites in California? Yep. We would get calls at the museum, hey, what time should we come? What time of year? And it depends. If you want to see them in these dense clusters in the trees, anytime from around Thanksgiving to Christmas is sort of the peak for that. If you want to see lots of flying, and that's kind of what a lot of people want to see. You walk in the sanctuary and just butterflies flying everywhere, mating, spiraling mating dances and all that. That's going to be closer to the spring. This is a really exciting time to be there. So you'll see the males chasing the females through the air, oftentimes in these elaborate kind of spiral chase scenes. The male's goal is he'll grab onto the female mid-flight and then we'll stop flying. So then they both kind of fall like a rock down onto the path. The male could, you would think, just mate there on the ground. You think it'd be easier, but no. He will then carry her or attempt to high up back into the trees. And at this point, the female's gone dead weight, and she kind of just hangs there, and the male's trying to fly up into the trees. I'd say about half the time or more, they split sometime during this flight, and the female gets away. And so it's a way that only the strongest, fittest males, especially since this has been 6 to 7 months into their lifespan now, and they still have to be fit and strong enough to carry out this final feat. So only the strongest, fittest individuals get to pass on their genes. If they make it up into a tree, fertilization happens, which is what we're seeing here. This is a mid-flight. I'm not sure if that one was successful or not, but this is the female on the back, the male here. And then, and if you've ever wondered how to tell male versus female, if you have a chance to see one up close in your yard or garden, we have a male here on the left and a female on the right. Can anyone pick out the differences? Wing shape. It's a good guess. I think this one here is just holding its wings a little farther back. They can kind of flex them up or down.
There's yellow spots on this one.
Yellow spots. I do see that different coloration here. It's not the easiest way to tell, though. And to my knowledge, this is just more an individual difference than anything else. Last guesses, observations? It's not easy. All right. On the males, you'll notice these two spots. These two, I know, it's pretty obscure. But it is noticeable, I promise. If you can pick it out if you see one on a plant. The males have these two spots, and if you look at them under a microscope, they're actually clusters of scales. They're little raised bumps, and they release pheromones out of those spots to let other butterflies know they're males. It's not as noticeable in this picture, but the male's lines are also much thinner than the females. So these lines, the black lines, pretty thin on the male, pretty thick on the female. And also no dots back here on that back wing. Okay, so once the female has those fertilized eggs, she will head away from the coast. There is no native milkweed that grows within about a 10 to 15 mile strip of the California coast. So monarchs won't find milkweed there. So one of the things that kicks off their migration away from sanctuaries in the spring is their initial search for milkweed. So that draws them out of places like Pacific Grove, away from Santa Cruz, and inland to places like the Central Valley. So she will need to find milkweed and will lay those eggs there. So being here in the Central Valley, you could encounter monarchs in decent numbers at sort of two distinct times of year. One being in the fall, so I would say anywhere from that August, September, October time period. Has anyone seen many monarchs this fall or in the past few months coming through this area? None. So you might see them as they're coming this way towards California, then they're going to be here for most of the winter, and then again in the spring, you might see them as they recolonize their summer or breeding range coming away from the coast. Okay, so we know quite a bit about monarch population, Western monarch populations, and what we know from going out and counting them. There are a lot of dedicated volunteers up and down California coast that get out and count the monarchs. One of the big efforts is led by the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They have a great website, xerces.org. They study and research and conserve all sorts of invertebrates, from aquatic inverts to beetles, bees. They do a lot of work with pollinators, including bees, and also have a big kind of monarch branch. They coordinate the Western monarch Thanksgiving count with the idea that theoretically every Western monarch around Thanksgiving, which happens to be the peak overwintering part of the season, it's when the populations in these overwintering sites are the highest, every Western monarch should be in one of the California overwintering sites at that time. So if we could get enough volunteers to blanket enough of those coastal overwintering sites around the same time, and all count kind of at the same time of year, we could come up with a population of Western monarchs for that year. And so before we get to kind of what the data is telling us about the monarch population right now, when we talk about counting monarchs, people sort of look at us like we're crazy, especially when they see how dense some of these clusters can be, and they wonder how the heck could you count those? And so I thought we would go through a little exercise here and I can give you a little tutorial on how we would count monarch butterflies. The first thing you need to know is we count when it's very, very cold. So we go out almost always right around sunrise. So the temperature is below about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the threshold for most monarch activity. So they can walk around if it's around 50 degrees or even 45 degrees. They might be able to move a little, but they can't fly. Once it starts to creep up warmer than about 55 degrees, they can start flying around. And nobody's counting flying monarchs. Okay, that would just be a little too crazy. So nobody can be flying. In fact, if we're mid-count, even if we've been counting for over an hour and we've got good solid data on our clipboards, and we see more than about 10 flyers, and we have a column on our sheet for flyers, and we can count up to about 10. If there's more than about that, we have to stop, we scrap all the data, and we come back another day. That's a total bummer when that happens. So let's imagine it's cold enough, nobody's flying around, and we're looking at this cluster. We wouldn't count every individual. We would pick a small part of this cluster, and I'd be out here with a few co-volunteers counting. We'd each have binoculars. This might be as high as 60 feet up in a eucalyptus tree, or in this case, a cypress tree. And I would say, okay, I'd be looking, and I would count these on the tip of the cluster. And I'd say, okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is about 20 monarchs on the tip here. I would then, in my mind, I would draw a little shape around those 20, and I would sort of move that shape around the cluster while looking through with my binoculars and see how many times this shape of 20 would fit around the rest of the cluster. So I'd say, okay, it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In this case, it'd be about 17 groups of 20. You can do some quick math. This is about 340 monarchs just here on this front. That would be my guess. Okay? There's also a provision, and Xerces will send folks out to train our counters in these different overwintering sites in California. They have a provision for if an object is really three-dimensional and not just like monarchs on one side of something, you add 30%. So this would be a case where we would do that. So we would take our, what I say, 340, 30% of that is 85. The number for this cluster would be 425. So I would have that number in my head, I would write it down. My other counters, I would let them finish without sort of skewing their number with mine, and then we would all turn and honestly share our numbers. Now, if one person says, I got 800, I would say, whoa. And then I'd say, I got 4, and we would talk. If our numbers, though, were within about 20% of each other, we would average the 3 or 4, and that would be our number for the cluster. So it's a long, kind of arduous task, because this is just one cluster of 425 butterflies on a day when we might have 17 to 25,000 monarchs. So it takes a while, it's meticulous, we go through, and then at the end of the day, we still know that we have a plus or minus margin of error. And the data has been, this Western monarch count data has been collected since 1997. It's freely available on xerces.org and westernmonarchcount.org. You can see kind of a decline starting in 97 was a banner year, over 1.2 million monarchs. This data is prettier to look at on this graph, but it is the same data. So again, this is all of California, all of the Western monarch population. And what we've seen is over 90% decrease since 1997 in the Western monarch. One thing that drives the decrease home with this graph even more than the bars here are the number of monarchs. I don't know how easy it is to read. So up here, 1.2 million. The lowest year, 2020, where there were just over 1,000 total butterflies, a near total collapse, and then a bounce back in 2021. But something that makes this even more powerful as an indicator of a decline is this blue bar. So this shows, or this line, this shows total number of sites monitored. So here in 1997, to find 1.2 million butterflies, they only had to check right around 100 sites. Okay, so 100 sites, 1.2 million. Here in 2021, they checked nearly 300 sites and still only found around 220,000 monarchs. So there's no arguing, or there's no two ways around there being a decline in this population. It's interesting, the Eastern monarch data kind of overlays pretty well. They have also had a decline in their population. We'll talk about why as we go on. So again, the Western monarch in particular declined by over 99%. The biggest factor being the loss of breeding habitat. When you talk about a butterfly with a host plant, breeding habitat, and this is something that makes their recovery seem more attainable. It's not that vast parklands need to be reestablished or football fields of land need to be ripped back away from developers. Their breeding habitat is just milkweed. So if there is more milkweed, it can pretty easily contribute to the monarchs continuing to rebound from what we've saw in 2020. This is just showing that in the 1980s, there were tens of millions of butterflies. Today, or in 2018, for every one butterfly, there were, I think, 160 butterflies in 1980. So again, just highlighting that decline. There was a really great report put out by the Xerces Society in 2016 establishing a couple, frankly, kind of depressing statistics, so we'll race through them. They established that there was a 72% extinction risk right here over 20 years and an 86% extinction risk over 50 years. So they're saying that in the next 50 years, there's an 86% chance that the Western monarch would no longer exist. Okay, I promise after this one it gets more upbeat. In 2020, at a time when the world was already hurting with COVID and everything, was one of the worst Western monarch years on the books. Pacific Grove Sanctuary had 0 monarchs. 0, not a single monarch came to Pacific Grove. And the total, this is the total Western monarch California count, was 1,899. It's still not completely known what led to this collapse. However, in that Xerces publication I just showed, they established an extinction threshold. So they said that 30,000 butterflies, monarchs, was about the extinction threshold, meaning that once monarch populations were below that, they would be at a much higher risk to going extinct. A bigger population can better weather certain singular events, like a big storm, big forest fire, but once the monarch population was under that 30,000 individual threshold, that they were at extreme risk for extinction. Still, that being said, I have yet to hear what explains this very, very low number. But then we had 2021, and I really heard people who thought that they were just never going to come back to Pacific Grove again, that they were done, and then we had a population bounce up to 14,000 in the sanctuary in Pacific Grove, and a state population, or a total western monarch population, of 250,000. So one of the things that is hopeful about monarchs and insect conservation in general is because they lay so many eggs, they do have the ability, well, first, their populations are naturally marked by big swings. The problem is when you have those big swings, when you have such a low population to begin with, you don't want the swings to be so big that they get too low, and that's kind of where that extinction threshold comes in. But you can have bounce backs like 1,000 total population to 250,000 across 1 year. That is something that can happen, and it did happen in the past 2 years. Counting isn't the only type of data that's being collected. There are also folks tagging. So if you ever see a monarch with a tag on it, I don't know how many people have community gardens or milkweed in their yard or otherwise see monarchs, but definitely if you ever see a tagged monarch, try to get a picture of it. Each one's going to have a number, it'll have sometimes an email address, and then you can go, or a website, you can go on yeah, I see some faces like, how do you tag a butterfly? So because they're one of the bigger butterflies, again, almost a 5-inch wingspan, they can handle, it's basically like a little fruit sticker. Picture like a little apple sticker that gets stuck on the outside of the wing. It's done very delicately. And they can still make full migrations. So a lot of that migration map that we've seen a few times of the lines going from Great Lakes to Mexico or British Columbia to California, those lines are data. They are data that is largely tagging data. And some really neat things have been learned. So there have been times counting in the Pacific Grove Sanctuary where we spot a monarch with a sticker or a tag. We go and get a long lens, get a picture, and are able to send it to a researcher and find out where that monarch came from. All right. Parasites can be an issue for monarchs, and this is when we start to talk about milkweed. Does anyone have milkweed in their garden, yard, community garden? Anyone? Yeah, it can be a hard plant to find. One of the easiest places to find it is big box, Home Depot, Lowe's, but they often have the wrong type of milkweed. So they'll have a tropical species and that can harbor higher levels of this parasite. So those tropical milkweeds, specifically Asclepias curicivica, tend to be perennials. So they subsist year after year. And native milkweeds die back every year. And when they die back, the parasite, it's called OE, it's a protozoan parasite that is on the monarch, and then is deposited on the milkweed when they lay eggs. That milkweed dying back each year and the monarchs all leaving that breeding range and it dying keeps those parasite loads they reset every year. They die back to zero and the milkweed grows fresh the next year. When you have a tropical milkweed that's either in a greenhouse or brought indoors in the winter, it can harbor higher than tolerable levels of this parasite and lead to reduced reproductive and migratory success with monarchs. So we can kind of see, and we'd have people at the museum all the time calling in and saying, hey, my chrysalises have spots, and we'd ask, okay, what kind of milkweed? And oftentimes it would be a tropical milkweed species. It can lead to, once they go into that pupating stage, they just sort of don't make it through. So yeah, and they're microscopic, so that's another thing. Sometimes folk would say, oh, but my tropical milkweed looks healthy, it's blooming, it looks great. You can't, this is a microscopic protozoan parasite. So you could look like your plant is beautiful and thriving, but it could have this parasite on it. So, native milkweed. Xerces.org, I think Monarch Joint Venture, there are all sorts of resources where you can find seed locators. You can first find out what milkweed is native to your area. Narrowleaf is a really good one for most of California. And it will grow more like that annual. It will die back in the winter, and it will be a great host plant to monarchs as they pass through.
That parasite can't be on those particular plants?
It could be. So the question was, could that parasite be on those plants?
The ones that are available native, I guess.
The native ones, right. They still could be, but since that native plant dies back every year, as part of the natural cycle. So if you had a native milkweed in your yard, it would probably be dead or dying right now. It would fully die as the winter went on, and then it would grow back from seed the next year. Whereas if you had a tropical milkweed, there is a chance at least that it doesn't die back, and then it would have whatever parasites it has this year, and then it would get another load of parasites from the next year's monarchs, and it would continue to build up, is the thinking behind it. Good question. So the best thing we can do, plant native milkweed if you can. Nectar plants as well, so if you can't find or can't plant native or milkweeds at all, monarchs still need nectar. So through most of their migration, actually through their entire migration, if you're thinking about what we call that super generation, the one that's living a long time and flying a really long ways, but even for the ones that are making their way back and are looking for milkweed, they need milkweed to lay their eggs, but they also need nectar plants to eat, to fuel. So having native nectar plants, flowers, blooming flowers, as well as native milkweed if you can, are the best ways. Climate change also makes things more difficult for monarchs as the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events increases. Think about a small, lightweight insect making long distance migrations. Changes to climatic and weather patterns that they might be used to or might be banking on can be problematic. So anything we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, and I know we hear this a lot these days, but it really is true, will benefit lots of animals and habitats, and monarchs included. Okay, and then my last message on that is I often get asked, especially by students, like, why should we care about monarchs? And some of the answer is they're pollinators, and we hear about that a lot with bees. But for me, the best answer I ever came up with, and the one that makes the most sense to me when I think pragmatically, is that monarchs are an indicator species. So if habitats and ecosystems aren't strong enough and robust enough and biodiverse enough to support monarchs, they're probably also not supporting many other insects and organisms that we're just not noticing. So we've tracked this decline in monarchs because they're beautiful and noticeable. So we noticed it. We see this downslope and we have the data, right? Think about how many bugs and insects and things that are super important to ecosystems and habitats have also done this, but we just didn't track it because they weren't pretty and big and soar through the sky. So if we can restore habitats to a place in which they can support this kind of iconic ambassador animal, we think of all the other animals that'll be brought along for the ride. All right, and there's one more thing I want to share. Has anyone ever heard of the zombie butterflies? No. I know a couple of us have because we were talking about it. So this is just a funny story I wanted to share. I mean, not funny, well, kind of funny, but it sort of caught fire online. One of those cold mornings that we were counting butterflies at the sanctuary, we came upon these butterflies. So we were towards the end of the count. We had gone into the central part of the sanctuary, so off the trail. And this is one of those times there are about 17,000 butterflies, so the numbers are pretty good. But we start to see a bunch on the ground. And so we have a column for grounders. So we say, okay, we have a grounder. Oh my, whoa, there's a lot of grounders. There were hundreds, probably about 200. And some of them are crawling around, and this happens. They get knocked out of the trees at night by wind, and then they crawl their way to a tree trunk and make their way up again. It's too cold to fly at this point. But then I think we gently tried to help one out of the way because it was right on a kind of a well-worn path. And we noticed it didn't have an abdomen. Its abdomen was completely missing, almost like it had been surgically removed, cleanly cut, snipped right at the thorax. So again, and the abdomen is this big black back part of the butterfly. And so we dubbed them the zombie butterflies because they were missing half their body, but still alive. They were kind of like the Walking Dead. And I forget how the word got out, but news agencies came and interviewed us, and then all these, I like which one was it, this one? The Case of the Zombie Monarchs and the Hipster Squirrel. That was my favorite one. And And so, but it was a mystery. We had no idea. So we started to research what monarch predators might be in our area. There are parasitic flies that can lay eggs in the monarchs, and they hatch out and kind of eat them from the inside. There are wasps, carnivorous wasps, that will sometimes target monarchs. And we actually had some hornet nests in the ground around the sanctuary. So we were thinking wasps for a while. But then, oh, here's my fun little zombie monarch icon. Oh, here's an up-close picture. So this is the thorax. Legs would be on the opposite side. You just can't see them. Here's that bright orange back. And just no abdomen. And this guy was fully alive, walking around. And there were probably about 200 that were like this. And then we realized it was a squirrel. And this came about because you can see him up here. I don't know, the lighting isn't great. Here's the first glimpse we got of Mr. Squirrel. Up there, munching on a monarch. Little rascal is right. Here he is again.
Just bites it off and just puts it
They eating them like, yeah. And this one here. And then it got really bold. It was just down on the ground eating monarchs. And to complicate matters, this is a non-native eastern fox squirrel, I think they're called. And not native to California, but they've been here a while. And so it kind of put us in this pickle of what to do. It was a great monarch year. We had 17,000 monarchs. They had only, at this point, eaten about 200 or so. But there were people in the community who wanted us to go out there with BB guns and traps, and cooler heads prevailed, and we kind of just let nature take its course. But this often rose the question of, I thought they were poisonous. Like, how is the squirrel eating them? There have been documented cases of grosbeaks, a type of bird that can surgically kind of eat only a certain part of the abdomen and avoid the toxic parts. We think, though, what's happening here, because there's nothing surgical about what this guy's doing, is that and I forget what researcher we talked to who posited this, or if we read it somewhere. Since these monarchs, they're so far removed from having had eaten any milkweed. So remember, they're the super generation. They haven't eaten milkweed at this point when they're in the sanctuary. I think this count this might have been part of our Thanksgiving count, or maybe even later. But they are at this point months removed from having eaten any milkweed. And so the thinking is that they've metabolized a lot of that poison out and are just not that toxic anymore. And that maybe this squirrel kind of did a little taste test, noticed that it wasn't that bad, and then really went to town and ate more. We haven't seen too much of this, although it does still happen on smaller scales. I was counting at the sanctuary a couple weeks ago, and there were some zombies, not 200, but they are still finding a few down on the ground. So chalk it up as another one of those things that we're still learning about this species. One of the things I love about monarchs is there's still so much to learn and find out, and still a lot of mystery. Yeah.
Would that affect their reproduction, not having an abstinence, like their sexual reproduction?
Yeah, so I think that the ones that we found had been eaten either early that morning or overnight, and probably wouldn't have lived much longer. So they were probably on their way out at that point. So yeah, they wouldn't have reproduced or been able to probably fly or do much else after that. Yeah. And that's all I have for you, and I'd be happy to take questions if you've got them. Thank you. And this is my son and I